Mason Walker froze mid-step, his weathered finger hovering over the trigger of his Winchester. The massive grizzly lay motionless by the creek bank, golden eyes half-lidded, each labored breath rippling through its rain-soaked fur. It wasn't hunting or wounded, it was protecting something. "Jesus Christ," Ethan whispered, binoculars clattering against his chest as he stumbled backward. "Mason, look at its belly." The 70-year-old hunter's arthritic knees cracked as he crouched, squinting through decades-old instinct that told him to shoot, while something deeper, something that reminded him of Janet, told him to wait. Beneath the bear's massive chest and forelegs, tiny paws of different sizes and colors squirmed against its fur. "It swallowed them whole," Mason breathed, lowering his rifle. "Not to kill them, to save them." What could drive a predator to protect its natural prey? And why did Mason feel, for the first time since burying his wife, that he'd been led here for a reason? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The town of Riverdale nestled in the shadow of Montana's Glacier National Park like a fading photograph, once vibrant, now weathered by time. At its edge stood Mason Walker's cabin, a testament to a life spent in these woods. 70 years had etched deep lines into his face, like the growth rings of the pines surrounding his property. 5 of those years had passed since Janet's cancer took her, each one stretching longer than the last. Mason's morning ritual remained unchanged. 2 coffee mugs set on the pine table, one emptied down the sink after a long stare at the vacant chair across from him. His hands, still strong despite his age, would trace the worn edges of their wedding photo before tucking it back beside his service medals. Vietnam had given him a slight limp and nightmares that occasionally still woke him. Janet had given him purpose. Without her, the cabin had become a museum of memories rather than a home. In town, folks knew Mason as the best guide this side of the Continental Divide, retired now but still sought after for his near-supernatural ability to track. What they didn't know was that he'd ventured into the woods that morning with no intention of returning. The hunting rifle had been packed for a different purpose entirely. Ethan Collins was Mason's unlikely friend, 25 years younger, owner of the local hunting supply store, and one of the few people who still checked in on the old man. Unlike most of Riverdale's residents who saw the world in black and white, Ethan existed in shades of gray. He sold hunting gear, but donated to conservation groups, a middle ground perspective that made him the perfect buffer between Mason and his daughter Emma. Emma Walker hadn't spoken to her father in 3 years. The wildlife photographer had her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubbornness, but none of his acceptance of the old ways. Their last conversation had ended with slammed doors and accusations about Mason's lifetime of hunting that neither had been able to bridge. Dr. Sarah Mitchell ran the Wildlife Rescue Center 30 miles outside Riverdale, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and no patience for bureaucracy. At 58, she'd abandoned a lucrative veterinary practice to dedicate herself to the animals others had written off. She and Mason had crossed paths occasionally, their mutual respect tempered by fundamentally different world views. Then there was Victor Rawlings. At 65, the hunting outfitter commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His guided hunts were expensive and always successful, though rumors persisted about methods that skirted both ethics and legality. Mason had once counted him as a friend, before whatever darkness had taken root in Victor's soul had fully blossomed. None of them could have predicted how their lives would intertwine around one massive grizzly bear with a distinctive white scar across his muzzle. A bear the locals had named Thor years ago, when sightings were still rare enough to warrant naming. Mason's hunting boots sank into the soft earth as he inched closer to the massive grizzly. The bear's eyes, amber pools of exhaustion, tracked his movement, but the creature made no attempt to rise. 20 yards became 15, then 10. Ethan remained frozen several paces back, his breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. "Easy now," Mason whispered, though he couldn't have said whether he was talking to the bear or himself. He lowered his rifle completely, securing it across his back. Something about this scene felt sacred, like walking into church during prayer. As they drew closer, the movement beneath the bear became more distinct. A small head, black with pointed ears, poked out momentarily before retreating under the massive fur. Not a bear cub, a wolf pup. "That's impossible," Ethan murmured. "Grizzlies kill wolves. They don't shelter them." Mason raised his hand, signaling silence. His weathered eyes narrowed as he studied the scene more carefully. It wasn't just one wolf pup. As the bear shifted slightly, they could make out at least 3 different species tucked against its massive body. The wolf pup, what appeared to be a young lynx, and the unmistakable rust-colored fur of a fox kit. "In 60 years of hunting these woods, I've never seen anything like this," Mason said, his voice barely audible over the gurgling creek. The bear's breathing seemed labored, each exhale a low rumble. Blood matted the fur along its flank, evidence of a recent injury. Mason felt something shift inside him, the same feeling he'd experienced decades ago in Vietnam when he decided to carry a wounded comrade through enemy territory rather than leave him behind. The weight of the pistol in his jacket pocket, the one he'd brought to end his own life after 5 years of emptiness, suddenly felt obscene. "We need to call someone," he said finally, turning to Ethan. "Game warden?" Mason shook his head. "No?" "Sarah Mitchell." The look of surprise on Ethan's face was justified. Mason Walker calling the wildlife rehabilitator he'd argued with at town meetings for years, the woman who'd once called him a relic of a barbaric past during a heated debate about hunting zones. "She'll want to separate them," Ethan warned. "Put the bear down, probably." "Then we don't let her," Mason replied simply. The certainty in his voice surprised even him. "Make the call." While Ethan stepped away to find cell reception, Mason settled onto a fallen log, his eyes never leaving the bear. There was intelligence in those amber eyes, not just animal instinct, but something deeper. The massive creature could have easily killed both men, injured as it was. Instead, it had made a choice to remain still, protecting its unusual charges. "Janet would have loved this," Mason murmured to himself, the ghost of his wife briefly beside him on the log. She'd always seen beauty where he'd seen utility, life where he'd seen resources. Maybe that's why she'd married him, to teach him to see differently. If so, he'd been a poor student. It took almost 2 hours for Sarah Mitchell's rescue team to reach them. Mason spent the time talking softly to the bear, not moving closer, just letting the animal know he wasn't a threat. Twice, the wolf pup had ventured a few inches from safety, and each time the bear had gently used its massive paw to nudge the little one back underneath its body. The arrival of Sarah's team broke the fragile peace. 3 trucks, equipment rattling, voices calling out. Mason rose stiffly to intercept them before they could startle the bear. Sarah Mitchell hadn't changed much in the 3 years since their last confrontation. Still lean and efficient in her movements, still regarding Mason with a mixture of suspicion and reluctant respect. "Mason?" she acknowledged with a curt nod. "Ethan said you found something unusual. That's one way of putting it." He gestured toward the creek bank. "Bear's injured, but it's what's underneath him that'll interest you." Sarah's team approached cautiously, tranquilizer guns at the ready. When they saw the collection of young animals sheltered beneath the massive predator, a ripple of disbelief passed through the group. "This isn't natural behavior," Sarah muttered, raising her binoculars. "Something's wrong with it." "Or something's right with it," Mason countered, surprising himself with the defense. The plan came together quickly. Tranquilize the bear, separate the animals, treat any injuries, and assess next steps. Mason watched the preparations with growing unease. It felt like they were about to dismantle something miraculous without understanding it. "The animals stay together," he said suddenly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once commanded troops. "At least until we understand what's happening here." Sarah turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Since when does Mason Walker care about wild animal welfare? I thought your solution was usually a bullet." The barb stung, but Mason held his ground. "Things change. People change." Something in his tone must have reached her because after a long moment Sarah nodded. "We'll keep them together initially for observation. But I make no promises beyond that." When the tranquilizer dart found its mark, the bear made no sound, just a slow, dignified slump to its side. The team moved in quickly, securing the smaller animals before they could flee. The wolf pup snarled and snapped. The lynx kitten hissed. The fox kit trembled. None tried to escape. Instead, they huddled closer to their unlikely guardian. As they loaded the sedated bear onto a transport sled, Mason found himself helping, his experienced hands steadying the massive head with unexpected gentleness. He caught Sarah watching him, curiosity replacing her usual judgment. "You were going hunting today?" she asked, nodding toward his rifle. Mason looked away. "Something like that." The morning that had begun with thoughts of ending his life had transformed into something entirely different. As he helped load the animals into Sarah's transport vehicles, Mason felt a forgotten sensation stirring in his chest: purpose. The Wildlife Center was a collection of modern buildings nestled among old-growth pines, funded by wealthy donors whose names adorned the various structures. Mason had driven past it countless times but had never entered. Enemy territory, as far as he was concerned. Now, he followed the transport vehicles through the gates, his pickup truck feeling out of place among the center's official vehicles. Inside the main treatment facility, organized chaos reigned as Sarah's team worked to stabilize the bear, now officially dubbed Thor in their records, and assess the smaller animals. Mason lingered at the edges, an observer in an unfamiliar world. "Why would a predator protect other species?" one of the younger staff members asked as they monitored Thor's vital signs. "It wouldn't," Sarah replied, administering antibiotics to the massive animal. "Not without human interference." The implication hung in the air, that someone had somehow trained this behavior, that this wasn't a natural phenomenon but something manufactured. Mason found himself oddly defensive of the bear's dignity. "Maybe we don't know everything we think we do," he offered from his corner. "Maybe there's more to these creatures than what's in your textbooks." Sarah met his gaze across Thor's unconscious form. For once there was no hostility in her eyes, just genuine curiosity. "Maybe," she conceded. "That's what we're going to find out." As the day stretched into evening, Mason found himself unable to leave. He called Ethan to cancel their planned dinner, then settled into a chair in the observation room, watching Thor through the glass. The smaller animals had been placed in a large enclosure adjacent to the bear's recovery space, close enough to see and smell each other, but separated for safety. The wolf pup paced restlessly, occasionally pressing against the mesh barrier that separated it from Thor. The lynx kitten and fox kit huddled together in the corner closest to the bear. None showed any interest in the food provided. "They're stressed without him," Sarah noted, appearing beside Mason with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one, a peace offering of sorts, which makes no sense at all. Mason accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. When Janet was in the hospital, her cat stopped eating, wouldn't leave her empty bed for days. "Animals know more than we give them credit for." "I didn't know about your wife," Sarah said softly. "I'm sorry." 5 years ago. Mason's throat tightened. "Cancer." They sat in silence, watching the animals through the glass. Outside, darkness had fallen, and Mason realized he should head home. Yet the thought of returning to his empty cabin held no appeal. The pistol still weighed heavy in his jacket pocket, a reminder of what this day was supposed to have been. "I'd like to come back tomorrow," he said finally. "Check on them." Sarah studied him for a long moment before nodding. "We could use an extra pair of hands, especially someone who knows these woods and the wildlife patterns." It wasn't quite friendship, this fragile truce between them. But as Mason drove home through the darkness, the road illuminated only by his headlights and the vast canopy of stars above, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. The desire to see what tomorrow would bring. The morning dawned with a clarity that only comes after autumn rain, the mountains sharp-edged against a sky scrubbed clean of clouds. Mason arrived at the Wildlife Center earlier than necessary, the pistol he'd meant to use on himself now locked in his gun safe at home. Something had shifted in him, a crack in the foundation of grief he'd built his solitude upon. Sarah greeted him at the entrance, surprise flickering across her features at his punctuality. "Thor made it through the night," she said without preamble. "But we've got some complications." She led him through the facility to a conference room where several staff members huddled around a computer screen. Mason felt immediately out of place in his worn flannel and work boots among their technical gear and serious expressions. "This is Dr. James Whitford," Sarah introduced, gesturing to a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses. "He's our wildlife behavior specialist." "James, this is Mason Walker." Recognition dawned in the specialist's eyes. "The hunting guide. I've read about your tracking abilities." Mason nodded uncomfortably, unused to recognition from this crowd. "What's the complication with Thor?" Dr. Whitford turned the computer screen so Mason could see. "These are photos from a wildlife sanctuary raid 3 years ago in Idaho. Illegal exotic animal farm, trafficking protected species." He scrolled through images of deplorable cages and malnourished animals. "And this," he paused on a particular photo, "is what we believe to be Thor as a younger bear." Mason leaned closer. The image showed a smaller but still impressive grizzly with a distinctive white scar across its muzzle, confined in a too small enclosure adjacent to pens holding various other animals. "Are you saying Thor was raised in captivity?" Mason asked, pieces starting to click into place. Sarah nodded. "We believe he escaped during the raid. The sanctuary was in chaos. Multiple animals fled into the wilderness. Most were recaptured or didn't survive, but a few, including Thor, were never found." "That explains his unusual behavior," Dr. Whitford continued. "He was kept in close proximity to other species, possibly from a young age. He's imprinted with abnormal social patterns. Essentially, he doesn't know he's supposed to eat these animals. Instead, he's mimicking protective behaviors he may have witnessed." Mason felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness toward the bear. "So you're saying what we witnessed wasn't compassion, just broken instincts?" "Animals don't experience compassion the way humans do," Dr. Whitford replied with the practiced patience of someone who'd explained this many times. "They operate on instinct and learned behaviors. Thor's behaviors were shaped by unnatural circumstances." Something about this clinical assessment rankled Mason. Before he could respond, Sarah's phone rang. Her expression darkened as she listened to the caller. "There's someone at the front gate asking about Thor," she said after hanging up. "Victor Rawlings." Mason's back stiffened. "What does Victor want with Thor?" "Claims he has information about the bear's history. Says he's been tracking it for months." Mason and Sarah exchanged a glance of mutual suspicion. Victor Rawlings didn't do anything without an angle. "I'll talk to him," Mason offered. They found Victor in the reception area, his imposing frame making the space seem smaller. He wore hunting clothes despite the warm day, his weathered face set in what passed for pleasantness but never reached his eyes. Mason, Victor nodded, a smile that resembled a grimace crossing his features. Didn't expect to see you here among the bunny huggers. Victor, Mason acknowledged coolly. What's your interest in the bear? Victor's gaze slid to Sarah before returning to Mason. That animal's been on my radar for 2 seasons now. Unusual movement patterns, disrupting normal wildlife behavior in my hunting zones. He pulled out his phone, showing them a trail camera image of Thor. Been tracking him systematically, got a whole file on his movements. Sarah crossed her arms. And you're sharing this out of the goodness of your heart? Victor's fake smile didn't waver. Thought you might want to know what you're dealing with. That bear's not right in the head, dangerous, unpredictable. He seems pretty predictable to me, Mason countered. He's protecting smaller animals, not harming them. For now, Victor replied ominously. Nature always wins in the end, Mason. You know that better than most. He handed Sarah a thumb drive. My tracking data. Use it however you want. Just thought you should know what you're dealing with. After Victor left, Sarah turned the thumb drive over in her fingers. Why would he share this information? Victor doesn't share. He sells, Mason said grimly. He wants something. They loaded the drive onto the center's computer, revealing meticulous GPS coordinates and timestamps of Thor's movements over the past 8 months. The data showed a clear pattern. Thor had been systematically visiting areas just after Victor's guided hunting parties had moved through them. He's following the hunters, Sarah realized. But why? Before they could speculate further, a commotion from the main entrance drew their attention. Mason heard a familiar voice, one he hadn't heard in 3 years, and felt his heart constrict. Emma Walker stood in the reception area, camera bag slung over her shoulder, her auburn hair caught in a hasty ponytail. She'd lost weight since Mason had last seen her, the angles of her face sharper, more like Janet in her final months. "Dad?" Her voice held disbelief as their eyes met. "What are you doing here?" Mason struggled to find words, the prepared speeches he'd rehearsed for their eventual reunion abandoning him. "I found the bear," he managed finally. The silence between them stretched, weighted with 3 years of unspoken words. Sarah glanced between them, then tactfully excused herself. "I heard about it from a wildlife photographer friend," Emma explained, filling the awkward void. "Bear protecting other species. I didn't know you were involved. Happened yesterday. Ethan and I were out." Mason trailed off, unwilling to mention his original intent in those woods. Emma nodded stiffly. "I'd like to document it for National Geographic." "They're interested in the story." "Of course." Mason gestured toward the treatment area. "He's back there. Thor, they're calling him." They walked in uncomfortable silence to the observation area. Through the glass, Thor lay on his side, breathing steadily, the massive rise and fall of his chest the only movement. In the adjacent enclosure, the smaller animals remained huddled together, still rejecting food. "They've been separated for safety," Mason explained. Emma raised her camera, capturing the scene. "But they want to be together." Apparently, Thor was raised in captivity, some illegal animal operation in Idaho. That's why he's behaving this way. Emma lowered her camera, studying her father. "And that bothers you? The idea that it's not natural compassion?" Mason shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Maybe I wanted to believe there was more to it. Since when does Mason Walker, legendary hunting guide, care about a bear's motivations?" The question held the same edge as their last argument 3 years ago. "People change, Emma." She studied him for a long moment. "Mom always said you would, eventually." The mention of Janet hung between them, both blessing and wound. Before Mason could respond, Dr. Whitford approached with concern etched on his face. "Thor's rejecting the sedation. He's becoming agitated, trying to reach the smaller animals. We may need to move them further away." Mason and Emma followed him to the treatment area where Thor had indeed risen to his feet, swaying unsteadily but determinedly moving toward the mesh barrier. The smaller animals had pressed against their side of the divider, the wolf pup actually pawing at the material. "He'll hurt himself," Sarah warned, preparing another sedative. "Wait," Mason said, moving closer to the glass. "Look at them. They're not afraid of him." Thor let out a low rumble, not threatening, but almost conversational. The smaller animals responded with their own sounds, creating an unlikely chorus. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Whitford admitted, scientific certainty giving way to wonder. "It's not just learned behavior," Emma said quietly, camera forgotten at her side. "There's something more happening here." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of a local sheriff's deputy, his expression serious as he approached Sarah. "Dr. Mitchell, we've received complaints about the bear you brought in yesterday. Victor Rawlings has filed a claim that the animal has been attacking livestock in the county. He's got the county commissioner backing him." Sarah's face hardened. "That's ridiculous. Thor was nowhere near any farms." "Maybe not," the deputy said carefully, "but there's pressure to euthanize given his abnormal behavior and potential threat." "Potential threat?" Mason's voice rose. "That bear had every opportunity to attack me and Ethan yesterday. Instead, he was protecting orphaned animals." The deputy looked uncomfortable. "There's a meeting at the county office tomorrow morning. You'll have a chance to make your case there." After he left, a heavy silence fell over the group. Sarah was the first to speak. "Victor's moving fast. He must really want this bear dead." "But why?" Emma wondered. "What threat does Thor pose to him?" Mason thought about the GPS tracking data, Thor's pattern of following hunting parties. "I think Thor's been disrupting Victor's hunts, maybe retrieving wounded animals before Victor's clients can claim them." "That would explain why Victor's so determined," Sarah agreed. "His reputation is built on successful hunts. If clients aren't getting their trophies—" "This is about money," Emma concluded bitterly. "As usual." Mason felt the familiar divide opening between them, the fundamental disagreement about hunting that had driven them apart. But before it could widen further, he made a decision. "We need to prove Thor isn't a threat, and we need to understand why he's behaving this way." He turned to Sarah. "What if we put them together, under controlled conditions?" Dr. Whitford looked alarmed. "That would violate every protocol we have." "Thor protected these animals in the wild," Mason argued. "He's agitated because they've been separated. If we want to understand this behavior, we need to observe it naturally." Sarah hesitated, weighing professional caution against scientific curiosity. "We could use the outdoor rehabilitation enclosure. It's secure but gives them space. We'd need to monitor constantly." "I'll stay with them," Mason volunteered. Emma looked at her father with newfound curiosity, as if seeing him for the first time. "I'll document everything. It could help make the case that Thor isn't dangerous." And so, as afternoon stretched toward evening, they prepared the outdoor enclosure, a half-acre space surrounded by high fencing containing trees, a small pond, and various natural features. Thor, still groggy but determined, was transferred first, followed by the smaller animals in their carrier crates. Mason, Emma, Sarah, and Dr. Whitford watched from the observation platform as the crates were opened remotely. The wolf pup emerged first, cautious but determined, making a beeline for Thor. The massive bear lowered his head as the pup approached, allowing the small creature to press against his muzzle. The lynx and fox followed, each greeting Thor in their own way before settling against his massive form. "Well, I'll be damned," Dr. Whitford murmured, scientific skepticism momentarily abandoned. Emma's camera captured it all, the mechanical click, a counterpoint to the natural sounds below. Mason felt something loosen in his chest as he watched. a knot of grief and purpose untangling into something new. They trust him completely, Sarah observed, and he's protective without being possessive. As darkness fell, Mason insisted on staying, setting up a chair on the observation platform. Emma, to his surprise, decided to remain as well. They sat in what began as uncomfortable silence but gradually eased into something less strained. "Why were you really in those woods yesterday, Dad?" Emma finally asked, her voice soft in the darkness. Mason considered lying, then decided against it. "I was saying goodbye." The simple admission hung between them. Emma didn't ask for clarification, but her hand found his in the darkness, squeezing briefly before withdrawing. "I miss her too," she said finally. Below them, Thor curled protectively around his unlikely family, a living monument to the possibility that nature, like people, sometimes defied easy classification. And in that contradiction lay hope for both the bear and the humans who watched over him. Dawn crept across the Wildlife Center's grounds, painting the outdoor enclosure in hues of gold and amber. Mason stirred in his observation chair, neck stiff from his night's vigil. Beside him, Emma had fallen asleep, her camera cradled in her lap like a child. He watched his daughter's face in repose, struck by how much she resembled Janet, the same determined set to her jaw even in sleep, the same slight furrow between her brows. Below them, Thor and his unusual family were already awake. The bear moved with surprising gentleness for his size, shepherding the smaller animals as they explored their enclosure. The wolf pup, a female they'd named Luna, seemed especially attached to Thor, rarely straying more than a few feet from his massive form. The lynx kitten, dubbed Shadow, was more independent, climbing low branches but always keeping Thor in sight. The young fox, called Rusty for his vibrant coat, had the most playful demeanor, occasionally nipping at Thor's paws in a game only they understood. "They're like a family," Emma murmured, awake now and watching the scene. The wonder in her voice reminded Mason of when she was small, discovering the woods for the first time through his guidance. "Not like any family I've ever seen," he replied, but there was no judgment in his tone, only fascination. The door to the observation deck opened, and Sarah joined them, carrying 3 steaming cups of coffee. The morning light accentuated the silver in her hair, the lines of worry around her eyes. "You two actually stayed all night," she observed, handing them each a cup. "Any changes?" "They're settling in together," Mason reported. "No signs of aggression or stress." Sarah nodded, leaning against the railing. "The county meeting is at 11. Victor's gathered quite a crowd." Local ranchers, some of his hunting clients, people concerned about unnatural wildlife behavior. His words, not mine. Mason sipped his coffee, the bitter warmth fortifying him for the battle ahead. "What's our strategy?" "Science, evidence, and public opinion," Sarah replied. "Emma's photos could help sway the commissioners, and your testimony as a respected outdoorsman carries weight." Emma looked up from reviewing the images on her camera. "These are good, but we need more. We need to show Thor's intelligence, his gentleness, the fact that he's not just some confused predator, but a creature making conscious choices." Mason considered this. "What if we demonstrate it? Create a controlled situation that shows Thor's protective instincts aren't random?" Sarah looked skeptical. "Like what?" "A minor threat. Something that would trigger protective behavior without actually endangering anyone. I could enter the enclosure." "Absolutely not," both women said in unison. "I've been around bears my whole life," Mason insisted. "I know their behavior, their warning signs. Thor's been watching me since we brought him in. There's recognition there." "It's too dangerous," Sarah said firmly. "And unnecessary," Emma added. "We can make our case without risking your life." Mason might have argued further, but the arrival of Ethan interrupted them. His friend looked troubled as he climbed the steps to the observation deck. "Victor's been busy," Ethan reported without preamble. "He's got half the town convinced that bear is some kind of mutant threat, says it's been stealing game from legal hunts, threatening livelihoods." "Stealing game?" Sarah repeated. "That's what this is about?" Ethan nodded grimly. "According to Victor, Thor's been following hunting parties, retrieving wounded animals before hunters can track them. His clients pay top dollar for guaranteed trophies. If they're losing their kills, they're not their kills until they recover them," Emma said sharply. "That's the rule, isn't it? If an animal escapes, it's fair game." "Technically, yes," Mason agreed. "But no one's ever had to compete with a grizzly bear deliberately saving wounded animals." The implications settled over the group. Thor wasn't just acting against his predatory nature. He was actively interfering with human hunters, perhaps intentionally. "We need to get to that meeting," Sarah decided. "And we need more than just pretty pictures. We need to understand exactly what's been happening in those woods." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Whitford arrived with a thick folder under his arm, excitement visible in his usually composed demeanor. "I've been analyzing the tracking data Victor provided," he announced, "and cross-referencing it with reports from other wildlife researchers. Thor's movements aren't random. He's been systematically patrolling areas after hunting parties move through, and here's the fascinating part. He only follows certain hunting groups." "Let me guess," Mason said. "Victor's clients?" Dr. Whitford nodded. "Exclusively. He ignores other hunters completely." "That's targeted behavior," Sarah said slowly, "almost like he knows who Victor is." "Or what he represents," Emma suggested. Mason thought back to the photos of the illegal animal sanctuary where Thor had been kept. What if Thor associates certain hunting practices with his captivity? Victor's methods aren't always ethical. "You're suggesting a bear is capable of moral judgment?" Dr. Whitford looked skeptical despite his earlier excitement. "I'm suggesting a bear is capable of remembering who hurt him," Mason replied, "and maybe who hurt others like him." The county office building was a bland concrete structure at the edge of town, its parking lot already filled when they arrived. Mason recognized most of the vehicles, local ranchers, business owners who depended on hunting tourism, and at the center, Victor's customized truck with its rack of antlers mounted above the cab like a macabre crown. Inside, the meeting room was standing room only. Victor had positioned himself near the front, surrounded by supporters. His eyes narrowed when he spotted Mason entering with Sarah and Emma. "Quite the coalition you formed, old friend," Victor called out, loud enough for others to hear. "The hunter, the tree hugger, and the prodigal daughter. Touching." Mason ignored the bait, guiding his group to the few remaining seats. The county commissioners, 5 men and 2 women, most of whom Mason had known for decades, sat at the raised table at the front, their expressions carefully neutral. Commissioner Martha Jennings, a cattle rancher in her 70s and the board's longest-serving member, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the grizzly bear currently being held at the Riverdale Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. There's been a petition filed by Mr. Victor Rawlings requesting the animal be designated as dangerous and euthanized according to state wildlife protocols." Victor rose to speak first, his bulk commanding attention. "This isn't about one bear, commissioners. This is about precedent, about maintaining the natural order. This animal has been interfering with legal hunting activities, damaging local businesses, and displaying deeply unnatural behavior. It's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt." He proceeded to show trail camera footage of Thor retrieving wounded deer and elk, carrying smaller animals in his mouth without harming them, and in one particularly effective clip, standing between a hunting party and a wounded moose. "This bear doesn't just scavenge our kills, he actively prevents recovery," Victor concluded. "And now he's collecting smaller predators." What happens when he decides to add a human child to his collection? Are we going to wait until tragedy strikes? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mason felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. Victor had framed his argument perfectly for this audience, appealing to their fear of the unnatural, their economic concerns, and their protective instincts toward children. When it was their turn to present, Sarah went first, offering a clinical explanation of Thor's likely history in captivity and how it had shaped his unusual behavior. "This bear isn't a threat," she insisted. "He's a product of human interference in his development. If anything, we should be studying his behavior, not destroying him for adapting to the trauma we inflicted." Dr. Whitford followed with scientific data on behavioral imprinting and cross-species bonding, but Mason could see the commissioner's eyes glazing over at the technical terminology. When Emma stepped forward with her camera and laptop, however, attention sharpened. The photographs she displayed showed Thor's gentle interactions with the smaller animals, his careful grooming of Luna, his patient tolerance of Rusty's playful antics, his watchful protection of Shadow. "This isn't just abnormal behavior," Emma argued passionately. "This is extraordinary behavior. Thor has transcended his natural instincts to protect these orphaned animals. He's showing a level of compassion that challenges our understanding of wildlife." Commissioner Jennings leaned forward. "Ms. Walker, these are beautiful images, but they don't address the economic concerns Mr. Rawlings raised. Our community depends on hunting tourism." "With all due respect, Commissioner," Emma replied, "one bear protecting wounded animals shouldn't threaten an entire industry, unless that industry relies on practices that can't stand up to scrutiny." Victor surged to his feet. "Are you accusing me of illegal hunting practices, girl? I'm saying that ethical hunters track their wounded game and finish the kill humanely," Emma replied coolly. "If Thor is reaching wounded animals before human hunters can, perhaps the question isn't about the bear's behavior, but about the hunters." The room erupted in angry shouts and counter-arguments. Commissioner Jennings banged her gavel repeatedly for order. Through the chaos, Mason noticed Victor's face, not angry, but calculating. This public confrontation was serving his purposes somehow. When order was finally restored, Mason rose to speak. The room quieted immediately. Despite the years of semi-retirement, his reputation still commanded respect. "I've hunted these woods for 60 years, he began, his voice steady, "tracked more game than anyone in this room, and I'm telling you, what I saw in that bear's eyes wasn't madness or confusion. It was purpose." He described finding Thor, the bear's calm acceptance of their presence, his gentle protection of the smaller animals. "Victor says this bear is disrupting the natural order. But I've been thinking about what that really means." Mason paused, gathering thoughts he hadn't known he possessed until this moment. Maybe the natural order isn't just about predator and prey. Maybe it's also about balance, about protection, about choices that serve life rather than death. He turned to face Victor directly. "You've been tracking this bear for months. You know his patterns, where he dens, where he travels. And yet you never took the shot. Why is that, Victor? A trophy bear like Thor would fetch a high price from your clients." Victor's expression darkened. "There are regulations about hunting grizzlies." "Which haven't stopped you before," Mason interrupted, a dangerous gambit. "No, you've been tracking Thor because he's been tracking you. He's been undoing your work, hasn't he? Saving the animals your clients wound but don't recover, making you look bad to people who pay thousands for guaranteed kills." The tension in the room was palpable. Victor's supporters shifted uncomfortably. "That's a serious accusation, Mason," Commissioner Jennings warned. "It's an observation," Mason countered, "based on 60 years of understanding these woods and the creatures in them, including the human ones." Before Victor could respond, the doors at the back of the meeting room burst open. Ethan rushed in, breathless, his expression urgent. "There's been a break-in at the Wildlife Center," he announced. "Someone cut the power and opened the enclosures. Thor and the other animals are gone." The meeting dissolved into chaos. As people rushed for the doors, Mason caught Victor's eye across the room. The faintest smile played at the corners of the outfitter's mouth before he turned away, pulling out his phone as he headed for the exit. "He planned this," Mason said to Sarah and Emma as they hurried to Sarah's truck. "The meeting was a distraction." "But why?" Emma asked, clutching her camera as they sped toward the Wildlife Center. "Why not just kill Thor when he had the chance?" "Because this way, Thor looks like a dangerous escaped predator," Sarah realized. "Any rancher or hunter who spots him now has legal justification to shoot on sight. And Victor gets exactly what he wants without directly breaking any laws," Mason finished grimly. At the Wildlife Center, they found the staff in disarray. The power had been cut to the security systems, and the gate to Thor's enclosure had been forcibly opened. There were no signs of the bear or the smaller animals. "They can't have gone far," Sarah insisted, organizing search parties. "Thor is still recovering from his injuries, and the little ones have limited stamina." Mason studied the ground around the enclosure, his tracking instincts kicking in despite the years. "They didn't escape," he said finally, pointing to the pattern of prints in the soft earth. "Thor was herded. Someone used techniques to drive him in a specific direction." "Toward what?" Emma asked. Mason's expression was grim. "Toward Victor's hunting lease, 3,000 acres of private forest where he takes his most exclusive clients." Understanding dawned on their faces. Victor hadn't just engineered an escape, he'd created a controlled hunt. Thor, confused and trying to protect his adopted family, would be driven right into the sights of waiting rifles. "We need to find them first," Mason said, already heading for his truck, "before Victor's hunters do." As they prepared to leave, Emma pulled her father aside. "Why are you doing this, Dad? This isn't like you." "You've hunted bears before?" Mason looked at his daughter, seeing Janet's questioning eyes in her face. "Your mother's last words to me were to find something worth protecting." He glanced toward the forest where Thor had disappeared. "I think I finally have." The search began as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley. Mason, Emma, and Sarah headed toward Victor's hunting lease, while other center staff and volunteers spread out to cover possible alternate routes. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every minute increased the chance that Thor would be spotted by someone with a rifle and a quick trigger finger. As they drove, Mason's mind raced through what he knew about Thor's behavior patterns, about Victor's hunting grounds, about the instincts of a wounded animal trying to protect its young. A theory began to form, one that seemed impossible yet strangely fitting. "I think I know where Thor's heading," he said suddenly. "And it's not random. He's been in these woods for 3 years since escaping that sanctuary. He would have established a territory, a safe place." "But where?" Sarah asked from behind the wheel. "His GPS tracking data shows movement all over this region." "Except for one area," Mason replied, pulling out the map they'd printed of Thor's movements. "There's a 5-square-mile section where he's never been recorded. Right here, at the edge of Victor's lease." Emma leaned forward from the back seat. "Why would he avoid that area?" "He wouldn't," Mason said with growing certainty. "He'd protect it by never letting himself be tracked there. It's where he feels safest, where he'd take the little ones if they were threatened." The location Mason indicated was a remote section of old-growth forest, bordered by a steep ravine on one side and a series of limestone caves on the other. It wasn't on any tourist maps, and local hunters generally avoided it due to the difficult terrain. "That's where we need to look," Mason insisted, "before Victor figures it out, too." As Sarah turned the truck onto a rarely used Forest Service road, Emma studied her father with new eyes. The man who had taught her to hunt as a child was now racing to save an animal he would once have considered a trophy. People could change, it seemed, perhaps even at 70. What none of them realized was that the day's events had set in motion forces that would change not just a bear's fate, but the course of all their lives. In the growing shadows of the Montana wilderness, old wounds and new beginnings awaited them all. The Forest Service road deteriorated rapidly, forcing Sarah to slow the truck to a crawl. Ancient pines crowded close on either side, their branches scraping against the windows like skeletal fingers. Mason studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had spent a lifetime reading wilderness signs. "Stop here," he directed finally. "We'll have to continue on foot. Any vehicle noise might spook Thor or alert Victor's people to our location." They gathered their gear in silence. Sarah with a medical kit for Thor's injuries, Emma with her camera equipment, Mason with a worn backpack containing water, basic provisions, and a hunting rifle that he caught Emma eyeing with disapproval. "It's for protection," he said quietly. "Not for hunting." The distinction hung between them, a fragile bridge across the chasm that had separated father and daughter for 3 years. Emma gave a small nod, neither accepting nor rejecting his explanation. The forest embraced them as they ventured deeper, the late afternoon light filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns. Mason moved with surprising agility for his age, reading subtle signs invisible to his companions, a disturbed patch of moss, a broken twig, the distinctive impression of a large paw in a muddy section of trail. "Thor came this way," he confirmed after examining a tree trunk bearing claw marks. "Not long ago. He's moving deliberately, not panicking." "How can you tell?" Sarah asked, adjusting her pack. "The marks are evenly spaced, consistent depth. When bears flee in panic, their movements become erratic." Mason pointed to smaller tracks nearby. "The little ones are still with him. He's keeping them close." They continued in the direction indicated by the tracks, the forest growing denser, the terrain more challenging. Emma stumbled once on a concealed root, and Mason instinctively reached out to steady her. Their eyes met in a moment of unspoken connection before both looked away, the gesture too reminiscent of earlier times. "Dad?" Emma said after they had walked in silence for nearly a mile. "What happened after I left? After Mom died?" The question pierced the forest quiet like a gunshot. Mason kept walking, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I kept going," he answered finally. "Did the only thing I knew how to do, hunted, guided, survived." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But surviving isn't living. Your mother knew that. I think maybe I'm just figuring it out." Before Emma could respond, the crack of a distant rifle shot echoed through the trees. Birds erupted from the canopy, their alarmed calls splitting the air. Mason froze, head cocked, calculating direction and distance. "Victor's hunters," he said grimly. "Northeast of us, maybe a mile. They're closing in." Sarah's face paled. "How much farther to these caves you mentioned?" "Not far. Half a mile, maybe less, but we need to hurry." They increased their pace, fatigue forgotten in the surge of urgency. The forest floor began to slope upward, the trees thinning as they approached a limestone ridge. Mason led them along its base until a dark opening appeared in the rock face, the entrance to a cave system known locally as the Widow's Hollow, named for its tendency to claim the lives of unprepared explorers. "Thor would know these caves," Mason explained, pausing at the entrance. "Bears often use them for denning. The little ones could easily navigate the smaller passages, but human hunters would struggle to follow." Another shot rang out, closer this time, followed by the faint sound of men's voices calling to each other through the trees. "They're coordinating," Mason muttered, driving Thor toward prepared positions. "We need to find him first," Sarah insisted. Those animals need protection. Mason nodded, unslinging his rifle and checking it with practiced hands. I'll go first. These caves can be treacherous if you don't know them. Stay close, watch your footing, and keep quiet. The cave entrance opened into a wider chamber, cool air washing over them as they stepped from sunlight into shadow. Mason pulled a flashlight from his pack, the beam cutting through darkness to reveal limestone formations shaped by millennia of water and time. The floor was uneven but showed clear signs of recent passage, disturbed earth, fresh claw marks on the walls. "Thor's definitely been here," Sarah whispered, examining the marks. "Recently, too." They proceeded deeper, following a passage that branched from the main chamber. The air grew damper, the sound of distant water echoing faintly. After a sharp bend, the passage widened again into a second chamber, smaller than the first but illuminated by a shaft of natural light from a hole in the ceiling. And there, in that column of dusty sunlight, stood Thor. The massive grizzly was positioned protectively before a small alcove where the three smaller animals huddled. His head swung toward the humans as they entered, nostrils flaring, eyes reflecting golden in the beam of Mason's flashlight. A low rumble vibrated from his chest, not quite a growl, but a warning. "Easy," Mason murmured, lowering his rifle and raising his free hand in a gesture that was half surrender, half greeting. "We're not here to hurt you, old boy." The bear's posture remained defensive, but the rumbling subsided slightly. Behind him, Luna the wolf pup whined softly, while Shadow the lynx kitten and Rusty the fox kit pressed closer together. "He's recognized us," Sarah whispered, "but he's still protecting them." Emma slowly raised her camera, capturing the scene. The massive bear, silhouetted in the shaft of light, standing guard over his unlikely family. It was an image that defied natural order, that challenged fundamental assumptions about predator and prey. It was, Mason realized, a testament to Janet's belief that love could transcend boundaries humans assumed were fixed. "We need to get them out of here," Sarah said urgently. "Back to the center where they'll be safe." Mason shook his head. "Victor's hunters are between us and the center, and Thor won't come willingly, not while he thinks the little ones are in danger." "Then what do we do?" Emma asked, lowering her camera. Before Mason could answer, a new voice echoed from the passage behind them. "You do nothing, Mason, except step aside." Victor Rawlings emerged from the shadows, rifle raised, flanked by two younger men similarly armed. His face wore an expression of grim satisfaction. "I figured you'd lead us right to him," Victor said, nodding toward Thor. "You always were the best tracker in these parts." Mason positioned himself between Victor's group and the animals, his own rifle held loosely but ready. "This isn't a legal hunt, Victor. That bear is a protected research subject." "That bear," Victor snarled, "is an abomination, a confused predator playing house with its natural prey. It's not right, not natural." "Since when do you care about natural, Victor?" Mason countered. "Your guided hunts aren't exactly sporting. Baited stands, wounded game left to suffer, trophies taken from animals that never had a chance." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Careful, old man. You're outnumbered and outgunned." "Am I?" Mason glanced meaningfully toward the cave entrance, where the silhouettes of several wildlife center staff had appeared, Ethan among them. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, neither side willing to back down. Thor sensed the tension, his rumbling growing louder as he shifted his massive weight from paw to paw. "This isn't just about a bear interfering with your hunts, is it?" Mason said quietly. "This is personal for you." Something flickered across Victor's face, a spasm of emotion quickly suppressed. "That animal has been a thorn in my side for 3 years, stealing game, disrupting hunts, causing me to lose clients. Business is business." "No," Mason shook his head slowly. "This is deeper than business. You knew Thor was from that sanctuary in Idaho. You knew his history. What aren't you telling us, Victor?" A tense silence followed, broken only by Thor's warning rumbles and the soft sounds of the smaller animals behind him. Then, unexpectedly, Victor lowered his rifle slightly. "That sanctuary," he said, voice tight with controlled rage, "was owned by my nephew. When the feds raided it, he went to prison, lost everything. His wife left him. He killed himself 6 months later." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, ripples of understanding expanding outward. Emma was the first to make the connection. "You blame Thor for your nephew's death." Victor's face hardened. That bear was the star attraction, the one that brought in the paying customers who wanted to see a trained grizzly. When he escaped during the raid, the business collapsed. Everything fell apart. "Your nephew was running an illegal exotic animal operation," Sarah pointed out. "Animals were suffering, dying. The raid wasn't Thor's fault." "My nephew made mistakes," Victor acknowledged grimly. "But he didn't deserve what happened to him. And that bear has been a reminder walking these woods ever since. Taking game from my clients, making a mockery of everything I built." Mason studied the man he'd once considered a friend, seeing now the depths of bitterness that had transformed him. "So, this is about revenge." "Call it what you want," Victor replied. "I call it setting things right." As they spoke, Thor had grown increasingly agitated, sensing the humans' conflict. He shifted position, herding the smaller animals deeper into the alcove, positioning his massive body to shield them completely. "Look at him, Victor," Mason urged, gesturing toward the bear. "Really look. He's protecting those animals the way your nephew should have protected his. Thor isn't your enemy. He's a survivor, just like the rest of us." For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered in Victor's eyes. Then his expression hardened once more. "Stand aside, Mason. I won't ask again." "I can't do that." Victor raised his rifle to his shoulder, sighting along the barrel. "Then you leave me no choice." What happened next occurred with the fluid choreography of instinct. As Victor's finger tightened on the trigger, Thor lunged forward with a speed belying his size. Mason shouted a warning, raising his own rifle. Emma screamed. Sarah dove for cover. The cave erupted in chaos, the thunder of a gunshot, the roar of a grizzly, shouts of alarm. Mason felt something hot graze his arm as he threw himself sideways, colliding with Emma and taking them both to the ground. More shots echoed in the confined space, the sound deafening. Then, abruptly, silence fell. Mason raised his head cautiously. The dust-filled shaft of light revealed a tableau frozen in time. Victor sprawled on his back, rifle several feet away, Thor looming over him with one massive paw raised for a killing blow. The outfitter's companions had fled, leaving him alone to face the consequence of his vendetta. "Thor!" Mason called, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "Easy now." The bear's head swung toward him, amber eyes meeting Mason's. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding beyond words, beyond species. Slowly, deliberately, Thor lowered his paw. With a final, rumbling warning to Victor, he backed away, returning to the alcove where the smaller animals waited. Victor lay motionless, eyes wide with shock at his brush with death. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. It could have killed me. Why didn't it?" Mason moved carefully to retrieve Victor's fallen rifle, wincing at the pain in his grazed arm. "Maybe Thor understands something about mercy that you don't." As the adrenaline of the confrontation ebbed, the full impact of what had transpired began to settle over the group. Thor had not only protected his adopted family, but had shown restraint when he could have easily killed Victor. It was behavior that defied explanation, or at least defied the explanations they'd been willing to accept. "We need to get everyone out of here," Sarah said, taking charge of the situation. "The gunshots will bring rangers and possibly local law enforcement. We need to control the narrative before this turns into a circus." Mason nodded agreement, then turned to Victor, who was slowly sitting up, his face ashen. "You have a choice to make, Victor. Continue this vendetta and face charges for trespassing, illegal hunting, and destruction of property at the center, or walk away. Let Thor live his unusual life with his unusual family." Victor looked past Mason to where Thor stood protectively before the smaller animals. Something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but a crack in the hardened shell of bitterness. "That bear really is something else, isn't he?" he said quietly. "Yes," Mason agreed. "He is." As they prepared to leave the cave, Emma approached her father, examining the graze on his arm with concern. "You were going to take a bullet for a bear," she said, her voice a complex mixture of accusation and wonder. Mason looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the same determination that had defined Janet, the same capacity for seeing beyond conventional boundaries. "Not just for a bear," he replied. "For what he represents. For the idea that we don't always have to be what nature or circumstance intended, that we can choose something different." Emma held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Mom would have approved. Outside the cave, the forest had fallen into the deep blue of early evening. The Wildlife Center staff had established a perimeter, keeping at bay the curious onlookers and local media who had begun to gather after the reports of gunfire. Sarah was already coordinating with park rangers, explaining the situation and advocating for Thor's protection. As Mason emerged into the fresh air, he felt a weight lifting, not just the tension of the confrontation, but something deeper, a burden he'd carried for 5 long years since Janet's death. In trying to save Thor, he'd found something of himself that had been lost. The sun dipped below the western mountains, painting the sky in strokes of gold and crimson. In that fading light, Mason Walker stood at the threshold between his past and whatever future awaited, a future that for the first time in years he found himself eager to discover. The storm came without warning 3 days later, rolling down from the Canadian border with a ferocity that turned noon to twilight. At the Wildlife Center, rain lashed against windows and wind howled through the surrounding pines, the sound eerily reminiscent of a wounded animal's cry. Mason stood at the observation window, watching Thor and his unlikely family huddled together in their reinforced enclosure, seemingly unbothered by nature's fury. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind of activity. The confrontation in the cave had attracted national media attention, with Emma's photographs appearing in major publications alongside headlines about the protector bear and his cross-species family. Sarah had been inundated with interview requests from wildlife organizations and research institutions eager to study Thor's unusual behavior. Even Victor, to everyone's surprise, had withdrawn his complaint against the bear, though he remained distant and unreconciled. "Weather Service says it's going to get worse before it gets better," Ethan reported, joining Mason at the window. "Flash flood warnings for the lower valleys, possible landslides in the foothills." Mason nodded, eyes fixed on Thor. The bear had positioned himself upwind, his massive body shielding the smaller animals from the driving rain. Even in these secured surroundings, his protective instincts remained vigilant. "Sarah wants to bring them inside before it gets worse," Ethan continued. "But the staff's worried about moving Thor. He's been getting more agitated since you brought him back from the caves." This was true. Though the bear had allowed himself to be transported back to the center without resistance, his behavior had changed subtly in the days since. He was more restless, pacing the enclosure perimeter at regular intervals, pausing to sniff the air as if searching for something. The smaller animals followed his cues, their own behavior reflecting his increasing anxiety. "He knows something's coming," Mason murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. "Something beyond the storm." You talk about that bear like he's human, Ethan observed, not unkindly. Mason shook his head. Not human. Just more than we've been willing to see. The emergency alert system on Ethan's phone interrupted their conversation, a harsh electronic tone followed by an automated voice warning of severe flooding along the river that ran through the valley beneath the wildlife center. Already, the narrow access road was likely becoming impassable. We should head back to town while we still can, Ethan suggested. Emma's already there, working on her photo essay. Sarah says they've got emergency generators and supplies to ride out the storm here. Mason's eyes remained on Thor, watching as the bear gathered Luna, Shadow, and Rusty closer beneath the shelter of an artificial cave in their enclosure. You go ahead. I'll stay. Mason, I'll be fine, Ethan. I've weathered worse than this. His friend hesitated, clearly torn between respect for Mason's autonomy and concern for his safety. Janet would have my hide if I left you here. The mention of his late wife brought a sad smile to Mason's face. Janet would understand some things are worth staying for. After Ethan's reluctant departure, Mason helped the center staff secure loose equipment and prepare for the possibility of power loss. The work was a welcome distraction from the memories that had been surfacing with increasing frequency since finding Thor. Memories of Janet, of their life together, of promises made as cancer slowly claimed her. Find something worth protecting, she had whispered in her final hours, her hand frail but warm in his. At the time, he'd nodded without fully understanding. Hunting had been his life's work, the taking of life, not its preservation. Now, watching Thor's gentle care of creatures he should by all natural law consider prey, Mason felt he was finally beginning to comprehend what Janet had meant. As evening approached, the storm intensified. Wind rattled the center's windows, and the power flickered ominously before steadying again. Most of the staff had retreated to the main building's living quarters, leaving only essential personnel to monitor the animals. Mason volunteered to keep watch over Thor's enclosure, settling into a chair in the observation room with a thermos of coffee and the rifle he still carried out of habit. Outside, rain fell in blinding sheets, transforming the carefully maintained grounds into a landscape of mud and standing water. Through it all, Thor remained a steadfast sentinel, his massive form barely visible in the growing darkness, but unmistakably alert, standing between his adopted family and the storm's fury. The first power outage came shortly after midnight, plunging the center into darkness for nearly a minute before the backup generators hummed to life. Mason watched the security lights flicker back on, casting weak pools of illumination across the sodden grounds. Something felt wrong, an instinct honed by decades in the wilderness warning of danger beyond the obvious. He was moving before he fully processed why, heading for the enclosure even as the rain soaked through his jacket and the wind threatened to knock him off his feet. The security panel beside the enclosure gate showed green, power restored, systems functioning, but the gate itself stood slightly ajar, the lock damaged not by the storm but by human hands. "Thor?" Mason called, shining his flashlight into the enclosure. The beam caught only emptiness. No bear, no smaller animals, just trampled vegetation and a section of fencing torn away at the rear. Alarm surged through him as he keyed his radio. "Sarah? Thor's gone. Someone opened the enclosure during the power outage." Her response was immediate, voice tight with concern. "Are you sure it wasn't the storm damage? The lock was tampered with. This was deliberate." A pause. Then, "Victor's people?" "Maybe." Mason was already moving toward the breach in the fence, tracking the massive paw prints barely visible in the mud. "I'm going after them." "Mason, no. It's too dangerous in this storm. Wait for backup." But Mason was 70 years old, and if a lifetime in these mountains had taught him anything, it was that waiting often meant the difference between life and death. Thor's injured and confused with 3 smaller animals to protect. In this weather, they won't last long. I can track them. At least take someone with you. There's no time. The trail's washing away with every minute. He hesitated, then added softly, I know what I'm doing, Sarah. Trust me. Before she could protest further, Mason switched off the radio and plunged into the forest, following the increasingly faint trail left by Thor and his unusual family. The rain hammered down relentlessly, each step a battle against mud that sucked at his boots and wind that stung his face with driven moisture. His flashlight beam bounced crazily through the darkness, illuminating brief snapshots of the storm-lashed wilderness. Thor's trail led steadily uphill, away from the flooding valley and toward the higher ridges where the caves had offered shelter before. It was the logical move for a creature seeking safety, but the terrain grew treacherously steep, slick rock faces and fallen trees creating obstacles that would challenge even a healthy bear, let alone one recovering from injuries and shepherding smaller animals. An hour into the search, Mason paused beneath the relative shelter of a massive pine, catching his breath and reassessing. The storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, the thunder now a constant rumbling backdrop to the wind's howl. His clothes were soaked through, his 70-year-old body protesting the punishing pace and conditions. Doubt crept in, unwelcome but insistent. Was he fooling himself, thinking he could track anything in this weather? Was his concern for the animals clouding his judgment? Too old for this, Walker, he muttered to himself, Janet's voice seeming to echo the sentiment in his mind. But as he raised his flashlight to continue, the beam caught a splash of color against the dark forest floor, rusty red fur clinging to a broken branch. Rusty, the fox kit, had passed this way, confirming Mason was still on the right track. Renewed determination pushed him forward, one laborious step after another. The trail ascended a rocky slope, becoming harder to follow as soil gave way to stone. At the crest, Mason paused again, playing his light across the landscape below. Nothing but driving rain and wind-whipped trees met his gaze. Then, a flash of movement, there and gone so quickly he might have imagined it. Mason focused his light on the spot, waiting. Again, movement, a small form darting between rocks, heading back toward him rather than away. "Luna," he called, voice barely audible above the storm. The wolf pup emerged from the darkness, soaked and muddy but unmistakable. She approached cautiously, stopping several yards from Mason, her young eyes reflecting the flashlight beam with an almost supernatural glow. "Where's Thor?" Mason asked gently, as if the pup might understand. "Where are the others?" Luna whined softly, then turned and trotted a few steps back the way she had come, stopping to look at Mason expectantly. "You want me to follow you?" he realized aloud. Like in those old movies Janet used to love. The absurdity of the situation was not lost on him. A 70-year-old former hunting guide following a wolf pup through a raging storm to find a bear that protected, rather than hunted, smaller animals. If he'd heard such a story a week ago, he would have dismissed it as sentimental nonsense. Now, he followed without hesitation as Luna led him down the far side of the ridge. The descent was treacherous, loose stones sliding beneath his boots, branches whipping across his face as the wind thrashed the forest. Twice he nearly lost his footing, saved only by last-minute grabs at sturdy tree trunks. Through it all, Luna remained just visible in his flashlight beam, pausing occasionally to ensure he was still following. They reached a stream bed, normally a gentle trickle, but now transformed into a roaring torrent by the storm's runoff. Luna hesitated at the edge, whining anxiously. Mason played his light along the bank, searching for a safe crossing point, when a different sound reached him beneath the storm's cacophony, a deep rumbling bellow of distress. Thor. Mason followed the sound upstream, Luna at his heels, until he reached a bend where the torrent had carved away a section of bank. There, half submerged in the churning water and struggling to maintain his footing, was Thor. The massive bear was trapped, one hind leg wedged between underwater rocks, his massive strength insufficient against the water's relentless force. Perched precariously on the bear's broad shoulders, barely visible above the waterline, were Shadow and Rusty, clinging desperately to Thor's thick fur as waves threatened to sweep them away. The bear was using every ounce of his remaining strength to keep his upper body above water, protecting the smaller animals even as the current threatened to drag him under. "Hold on!" Mason shouted, though he doubted Thor could hear him above the storm. He scanned the area frantically, looking for anything that might help. 20 feet upstream, a fallen tree stretched partially across the torrent, creating a natural, if perilous, bridge. Without hesitation, Mason made his way to the tree and began to edge out over the water, the rough bark slick beneath his hands and knees. The current pulled at the trunk, threatening to dislodge it with each new surge. When he had progressed about halfway across, directly above Thor's position, Mason paused to assess the situation. The bear's eyes found him, amber orbs reflecting not fear but exhaustion, and something Mason could only interpret as resignation. Thor had positioned himself deliberately to shield the smaller animals, sacrificing mobility and safety to become their living island in the flood. "I'm going to help you," Mason called, knowing the words meant nothing to the bear but needing to say them anyway. "Just hold on a little longer." He secured his position on the log, then uncoiled the length of rope he carried in his pack. One end he tied firmly around the trunk, the other he fashioned into a loop. Taking a deep breath, he lowered himself from the log until he dangled just above the churning water, then began to swing the loop toward Thor. The first attempt fell short. The second struck the bear's shoulder but slipped off. On the third try, the loop settled around Thor's massive neck. Mason pulled it snug, creating a tenuous connection between himself, the log, and the trapped bear. "Now comes the hard part, old boy," Mason muttered. Bracing himself against the log, he began to pull on the rope, attempting to provide enough counterforce for Thor to free his trapped leg. The bear seemed to understand, timing his efforts to coincide with Mason's pulls. For agonizing minutes, nothing changed. The water continued to rise, Thor's strength visibly waning, the smaller animal's position becoming more precarious. Then, with a suddenness that nearly sent Mason tumbling into the flood, Thor's leg came free. The bear lurched forward, fighting the current with renewed desperation. Mason hauled on the rope, guiding Thor toward the bank, every muscle in his aging body screaming with the effort. When Thor's massive paws finally found purchase on solid ground, the bear dragged himself from the torrent with his last reserves of strength. Shadow and Rusty still clung to his back, bedraggled but alive. Luna rushed to greet them, whining and circling as Thor collapsed on the muddy bank, sides heaving with exhaustion. Mason made his way carefully back along the log and down to where the animals lay. The storm continued unabated around them, but in that moment it seemed distant, irrelevant. He approached Thor cautiously, unsure how the bear would react to human presence in his weakened, vulnerable state. Thor's eyes tracked him, but the bear made no move to rise, no gesture of threat. Instead, he simply watched as Mason knelt beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from the massive body despite the cold rain. "You're quite something," Mason said softly, reaching out a tentative hand. To his astonishment, Thor allowed the touch, his coarse fur wet and matted beneath Mason's fingers, giving everything to protect them. "Janet would have loved you." As if understanding the words, Thor exhaled a long, rumbling breath that seemed to release some final tension. His massive head lowered to the ground, eyes drifting closed. For a heart-stopping moment, Mason feared the bear had reached his limit, that the ordeal had been too much. Then Thor's side rose again with a shallow breath, followed by another. Mason sat back on his heels, suddenly aware of his own exhaustion, the cold that had seeped into his bones, the precariousness of their situation. They were miles from the wildlife center, in the midst of a historic storm, with no realistic way to transport an injured 800-pound grizzly and 3 smaller animals to safety. "We need shelter," he murmured, scanning their surroundings. The rocky terrain offered little, just the scant protection of trees and outcroppings. It wouldn't be enough, not with the temperature dropping and Thor too exhausted to move further. That's when Mason remembered. An old Forest Service cabin, abandoned decades ago, but still standing the last time he'd passed this way, perhaps a quarter-mile upstream. If it had survived the years and the storm, it might offer enough protection for them to weather the night. "Come on, old boy," he urged Thor with no real expectation the bear would understand. "We need to move, just a little farther." To his amazement, Thor stirred, raising his massive head as if in response to the words. With what appeared to be monumental effort, the bear pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. The smaller animals gathered close around him, instinctively seeking his protection despite his weakened state. "That's it," Mason encouraged, backing away to give Thor space. "This way. Not far now." And so began one of the strangest processions in Mason's 7 decades of wilderness experience. An elderly man leading a grizzly bear and 3 smaller predators through a raging storm in search of shelter. Thor moved slowly, each step clearly painful, but with a determination that matched Mason's own. The smaller animals stayed close to the bear, occasionally looking to Mason as if for reassurance that he knew where they were going. The cabin appeared through the rain-lashed darkness like a mirage. A small, weather-beaten structure nestled against the hillside, its cedar-shake roof dark with moisture but intact. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, but the walls stood firm against the wind's assault. Mason approached cautiously, flashlight beam scanning the interior, a single room, dusty and long abandoned but dry. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, old furniture reduced to skeletal frames by time and rodents. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the worst of the storm. The challenge now was convincing an 800-pound wild predator to enter a human structure. Mason stood aside, gesturing toward the open door, feeling slightly foolish for the human gesture, but unsure how else to communicate. "In here," he called above the storm. "Shelter." Thor approached the cabin slowly, nostrils flaring as he processed the scents of old wood, dust, and human presence long faded. For a tense moment, Mason thought the bear would refuse, instinctive wariness overriding immediate need. Then Luna darted forward, slipping through the doorway without hesitation. Shadow and Rusty followed, disappearing into the relative darkness of the cabin. Thor watched them go, then turned his amber gaze to Mason, a look that seemed to contain both question and assessment. Mason met those eyes steadily, offering neither command nor entreaty, just patient presence. After what felt like an eternity, Thor lowered his massive head and lumbered through the doorway, his broad shoulders barely clearing the frame. Mason followed, closing the damaged door as best he could against the elements. His flashlight revealed Thor settling heavily onto the plank floor, the smaller animals immediately clustering against his damp fur. Outside, the storm raged undiminished, wind and rain battering the cabin like nature's artillery. "We made it," Mason said softly, easing his aching body onto an ancient chair that creaked ominously beneath his weight. "Now we wait." In the thin beam of his failing flashlight, Mason watched Thor's eyes drift closed, the bear's breathing deepening as exhaustion claimed him. The smaller animals remained alert a while longer, their eyes reflecting the light with jewel-like intensity, before they too succumbed to fatigue. As the night wore on and his flashlight dimmed to nothing, Mason sat in darkness, listening to the storm and the soft sounds of the sleeping animals. His thoughts turned to Janet, to the strange path that had led him from the brink of ending his life to this improbable moment of preserving others. "You were right," he whispered into the darkness, words meant for a woman 5 years gone. "There are things worth protecting, worth living for." In the deepest hours of the night, as the storm reached its furious peak, Mason felt, rather than saw, Thor stir. The bear rose with surprising quietness for his size and moved across the cabin. A moment later, a heavy warmth pressed against Mason's side as Thor settled beside his chair, the smaller animals repositioning themselves against both bear and man. In that moment, surrounded by creatures that defied every natural boundary, Mason felt a sense of connection that transcended words, transcended species, a recognition of shared purpose, of mutual protection against the storm's rage. It was, he realized with a clarity that brought tears to his eyes, exactly what Janet would have understood all along. Outside, the tempest continued its assault on the mountains, unaware that within a forgotten cabin an improbable family had formed, united not by blood or instinct, but by choice. By the simple, profound decision to protect rather than harm, to shelter rather than destroy. As exhaustion finally claimed him, Mason's hand rested lightly on Thor's massive shoulder, a connection between two aging predators who had somehow found a different path. His last conscious thought before sleep claimed him was of Janet's smile, how it would have bloomed at the sight of this impossible gathering, this defiance of nature's expected order. In that moment, balanced on the edge of consciousness, Mason could have sworn he heard her voice, carried on the wind that whistled through the cabin's aging beams. "You found it, love. You finally found it." The first light of dawn crept through the cabin's warped boards, painting thin golden lines across the dusty floor. Mason awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the heavy warmth pressed against his legs. Thor lay beside his chair, massive head resting on enormous paws, amber eyes already open and watching him with an intensity that seemed to transcend the natural barrier between species. "Morning, old boy," Mason murmured, his voice rough with sleep and age. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness, broken only by the steady drip of water from saturated branches. Mason rose stiffly, every joint protesting the night spent in the ancient chair. His clothes were still damp, clinging uncomfortably to his skin, but the immediate danger had passed. They had survived. The smaller animals stirred as he moved, Luna stretching her gray-furred limbs while Shadow and Rusty remained huddled together, watching him with cautious eyes. Thor made no move to rise, his breathing labored, sides heaving with effort that concerned Mason immediately. "Not doing so well, are you?" Mason knelt beside the bear, his experienced hunter's eye assessing the animal's condition. Thor's injuries from the flood had compounded his earlier wounds, and the night's exertion had depleted whatever reserves of strength remained. The massive creature was reaching his limit. Mason pulled his satellite phone from his pack, a precaution for his backcountry excursions that he'd never expected to use. To his relief, it powered on, showing a weak but present signal. He dialed Sarah's number, tension easing slightly when she answered on the second ring. "Mason? Thank God! Where are you?" "The search teams have been looking all night." "We're alive," he replied, voice steady despite his concern for Thor. "Found an old Forest Service cabin about 4 miles upstream from the center. Thor's with me and the little ones too, but he's in bad shape, Sarah. We need help." There was a brief silence as Sarah processed this information. "The roads are washed out and we've got landslides blocking the main access points. Even the helicopter rescue teams are grounded until midday." Her voice softened. Mason, is there any chance you can make it back on your own? With the animals? Mason looked at Thor, at the labored rise and fall of the bear's massive chest, at the smaller creatures pressed protectively against him despite his weakened state. No, he said simply. Thor can't travel, and I won't leave him. Another pause, then Sarah's voice, professional but tinged with genuine concern. We'll find a way to reach you. Just stay put and keep that phone on. After ending the call, Mason explored the cabin more thoroughly, searching for anything that might help their situation. In a rickety cupboard, he discovered a few dusty emergency supplies left by the Forest Service years ago. A first aid kit with expired contents, some sealed packets of water purification tablets, a space blanket with its silver surface dulled by time. He brought the space blanket to Thor, carefully draping it over the bear's massive form. Thor accepted this attention without resistance, his eyes following Mason's movements with what seemed like understanding. "Help's coming," Mason told him, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking to the animal as if he could comprehend. "Just need to hang on a little longer." The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Mason rationed his remaining water, sharing it with the smaller animals while keeping a watchful eye on Thor's deteriorating condition. The bear's breathing had grown more labored, each exhalation accompanied by a soft rumble that spoke of pain and increasing weakness. Mason found himself talking to Thor continuously, a one-sided conversation that ranged from practical updates on their situation to deeper reflections drawn from his 70 years of life. "Janet always said I talk to animals better than people," he confided, sitting cross-legged beside Thor's massive head. "Said I had more patience for creatures that couldn't talk back." Maybe she was right. Thor's eyes remained fixed on him, seeming to absorb each word with an attention that belied simple animal awareness. The smaller animals had settled into a pattern of restless sleep and brief explorations of the cabin, always returning to press against Thor's warm bulk. "You know what's strangest about all this?" Mason continued, gently checking the bear's wounds with experienced hands. "I came into those woods to end things. Had it all planned out. One last hunt. Only I was the target." He shook his head, still somewhat bewildered by the turn his life had taken. "Instead, I found you. And now here I am, fighting like hell to keep us both alive." A faint sound from outside interrupted his monologue, voices calling in the distance, human voices searching. Mason rose quickly, moving to the cabin door. "Here!" he shouted, voice stronger than he'd expected. "We're here!" The search party appeared through the trees minutes later, Sarah leading the way, followed by Emma and 2 Wildlife Center staff carrying emergency medical equipment. The reunion was a blur of relief and urgent activity as Sarah immediately began assessing Thor's condition. "His pulse is weak," she reported grimly after a preliminary examination. "And he's showing signs of internal bleeding. We need to get him stabilized before we can even think about transport." Emma had moved to her father's side, her camera forgotten as she took in his exhausted state. "Dad, you look terrible. Are you hurt?" Mason shook his head, suddenly aware of how he must appear, soaked, muddy, 70 years old, and having spent a night in the wilderness with a bear. "I'm fine. Just worried about Thor." Emma's expression softened, years of estrangement momentarily forgotten in the face of shared concern. "You saved them." "They saved me, too," Mason replied quietly. "More than you know." The wildlife team worked with practiced efficiency, administering fluids and antibiotics to Thor while checking the smaller animals for injuries. The bear submitted to these ministrations with surprising docility, his amber eyes frequently seeking Mason as if for reassurance. "I've never seen anything like it," Sarah murmured as she finished her treatment. "He's letting us help because he trusts you." Mason shrugged uncomfortably. "We understand each other, I think." Emma had been watching this interaction intently, her photographer's eye missing nothing. "Dad, when did you become the bear whisperer?" The question held no mockery, only genuine curiosity. "About the same time I stopped being just a hunter, I suppose," Mason replied. A new voice joined the conversation, deep, familiar, and entirely unexpected. "Guess we're all capable of changing, aren't we?" Victor Rawlings stood in the cabin doorway, his imposing frame silhouetted against the morning light. Behind him, 4 strong men carried a reinforced stretcher designed for large animal transport. Mason tensed immediately, moving protectively toward Thor. "What are you doing here, Victor?" To everyone's surprise, Victor removed his hat, a gesture of respect Mason hadn't seen from him in years. "I brought the transport team. My men know these back trails better than anyone. We can get Thor out through the North Ridge, avoid the worst of the landslides." Suspicion radiated from everyone in the cabin. "Why would you help?" Sarah asked bluntly. "You tried to kill him 2 days ago." Victor's weathered face revealed little, but something in his eyes had changed, a hardness diminished, if not entirely gone. "Let's just say I had some thinking to do. About revenge. About what my nephew would have really wanted." He gestured toward the smaller animals huddled against Thor. "About what this bear's been trying to do all along." "Which is what?" Emma pressed, clearly not ready to trust the man who had threatened her father. Victor surveyed the strange grouping of animals, his expression contemplative. "Protect what's vulnerable, even at his own expense." The outfitter's gaze shifted to Mason. "Seems like there's a lesson there, if a man's willing to see it." The tension in the cabin didn't fully dissipate, but it eased enough for them to formulate a plan. Thor's condition was critical. He needed proper medical care immediately, but conventional transportation was impossible with the roads washed out. Victor's proposal to use the North Ridge Trail was their best option, though it would require careful navigation and the combined strength of everyone present to move the massive bear. As they prepared for the journey, Mason found himself alone with Victor for a brief moment outside the cabin. The 2 men stood awkwardly. Decades of friendship turned rivalry, turned something more complex hanging between them. "Why the change of heart?" Mason asked finally. Victor stared into the distance, toward mountains both men had known intimately for most of their lives. "Been asking myself the same question. Maybe seeing you willing to die for that bear made me think. Maybe I'm just getting old." He turned to Mason, something like grudging respect in his expression. "Or maybe I finally realized my nephew wouldn't have wanted his memory used to justify more killing." Mason studied his old friend, seeing beneath the gruff exterior to the genuine struggle within. "Thor never killed your nephew, Victor. He was just another victim of the same situation." "I know that now," Victor acknowledged quietly. "Took me 3 years of hate to figure it out, but I got there eventually." The transport was as grueling as they had anticipated. Thor, heavily sedated, but still dangerously heavy, had to be carefully secured to the reinforced stretcher and carried through terrain made treacherous by the storm's aftermath. The smaller animals followed anxiously, Luna occasionally darting ahead as if scouting the path, Shadow and Rusty keeping pace with the human procession despite their evident exhaustion. By midday, they had reached the crest of the North Ridge, where a helicopter waited in a small clearing, arranged by Sarah through her wildlife conservation connections. The pilot looked dubiously at Thor's massive form as they approached. "You didn't mention it was a full-grown grizzly," he called over the idling rotors. "We're right at weight capacity as it is. Then we'll have to lighten the load," Sarah replied decisively. "Non-essential personnel only. The bear and 1 handler." "I'll stay with him," Mason said immediately. Emma stepped forward. "Dad, no. You're exhausted. Let one of the wildlife staff go." Mason shook his head, a familiar stubbornness setting his jaw. Thor trusts me. I started this journey with him, and I'll see it through. There was no time for prolonged debate. Thor's condition was deteriorating rapidly, each minute of delay potentially fatal. With swift efficiency, they loaded the sedated bear onto the helicopter, securing him as safely as possible given the constraints. The smaller animals became agitated as they realized they were being separated from Thor, their distress vocalized in whines and nervous movements. "We'll bring them in the second transport," Sarah assured Mason as he prepared to board. "They'll be right behind you." Mason nodded, then turned to Emma, suddenly aware this might be their last moment together if something went wrong. 5 years of estrangement and unspoken words hung between them. "Emma, if I don't—" "Don't," she interrupted fiercely. "Don't say it. Just go save your bear and then come back. We have a lot to talk about." He smiled faintly, recognizing Janet's determination in their daughter's eyes. "Yes, ma'am." The helicopter ride was a blur of noise and tension, Mason sitting beside Thor's massive form, one hand resting on the bear's flank to monitor his breathing. Through the window, he watched the storm-ravaged landscape pass beneath them, swollen rivers, mudslides scarring the mountainsides, uprooted trees scattered like matchsticks across valleys he had hunted for decades. It struck him then, with the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis, how his relationship with these mountains had changed. For most of his life, he had approached the wilderness as something to be conquered, its creatures as targets to be tracked and taken. Now, with his hand resting on the coarse fur of a bear that defied every natural law he thought he understood, Mason saw the land differently. Not as a challenge to overcome, but as a complex tapestry of relationships and choices, of lives intertwined in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. They landed at a regional veterinary hospital with specialized facilities for large wildlife, a place Mason had never had reason to visit before. A team of veterinarians and technicians waited on the helipad, rushing forward with a gurney and equipment as the rotors slowed. Mason found himself gently but firmly pushed aside as they transferred Thor to the gurney and rushed him inside. "Sir, you need to wait here," a young technician told him, blocking his attempt to follow. "The doctors need space to work." Mason wanted to argue, to insist on staying with Thor, but exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed him. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the night and morning ebbed away, leaving him hollow and unsteady. He allowed himself to be led to a waiting area, where he sank into a chair, the events of the past days crashing over him like a physical weight. Time passed in a strange fog of fatigue and worry. Mason must have dozed because he jerked awake to find Emma sitting beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "Dad, the doctor wants to talk to us." He blinked, disoriented, then focused on the woman standing before them, a veterinary surgeon in scrubs, her expression grave but not defeated. "Mr. Walker, I'm Dr. Reynolds. I've been treating the grizzly you brought in." She consulted a tablet in her hands. "Thor, I believe you've been calling him?" Mason nodded, throat suddenly dry. "How is he?" "Critical but stable." He suffered significant internal bleeding and trauma from both his original injuries and the subsequent exposure during the storm. "We've performed emergency surgery to address the most pressing issues." She hesitated, clearly choosing her next words carefully. "However, his recovery will be lengthy and complicated. Bears of his age and with his history of captivity face significant challenges." "But he has a chance?" Mason pressed. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "Yes, he has a chance. Much of it will depend on his will to recover." "And the smaller animals?" Mason asked, remembering with a pang the way they had huddled against Thor, their unusual bond seemingly essential to all their well-being. They've arrived and are being treated for exposure and minor injuries, Dr. Reynolds replied. All three appear to be in relatively good condition, considering the circumstances. Relief washed through Mason, so powerful it made him lightheaded. "Can I see him, Thor?" The doctor hesitated. "He's heavily sedated and in intensive care. It's not standard protocol to allow visitors for wildlife patients." "Please," Mason said simply. "I think it matters to him." Something in his tone must have conveyed the depth of his conviction, because after a moment's consideration, Dr. Reynolds nodded. "Briefly, and you'll need to follow all sterile protocols." They were led through a series of corridors to a large treatment room outfitted with specialized equipment. Thor lay on an enormous padded table, his massive body connected to monitors and IV lines, chest rising and falling with the assistance of a ventilator. He looked simultaneously more vulnerable and more magnificent than Mason had ever seen him. A creature of awesome power rendered fragile by circumstances, yet still imposing even in unconsciousness. Mason approached slowly, aware of Emma and Dr. Reynolds watching from the doorway. He placed his hand gently on Thor's head, fingers brushing the distinctive white scar that ran across the bear's muzzle. "Still fighting, old boy," he murmured. "That's good. Keep going." He leaned closer, voice dropping to a whisper meant for Thor alone. "We've got more to teach each other, I think." As if in response, one of the monitors beeped, showing a slight but noticeable strengthening of the bear's heartbeat. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward, checking the readings with professional interest. "That's unusual," she commented. "His vitals just improved." Mason nodded, unsurprised. He knows he's not alone. In the days that followed, Thor's condition improved steadily, more rapidly than the medical team had anticipated. Mason spent hours at the facility, dividing his time between Thor's recovery room and the separate area where Luna, Shadow, and Rusty were being housed. The smaller animals had recovered quickly, but showed signs of distress at being separated from Thor, a situation that concerned both Mason and the veterinary staff. "They've formed a genuine cross-species bond," Dr. Reynolds explained during one of their conversations. "It's unprecedented in documented wildlife behavior, especially involving a predator like a grizzly bear. Separating them permanently could have psychological consequences for all of them." "Then don't separate them," Mason suggested simply. Dr. Reynolds sighed. "It's not that straightforward. We can't just release a formerly captive grizzly with abnormal social behaviors back into the wild, especially not with a family of smaller predators. The wildlife authorities are already debating what should happen to all of them." This bureaucratic reality hung over the otherwise positive progress of Thor's recovery. As word spread about the protector bear and his unusual family, media attention intensified. Emma's photographs appeared in national publications, accompanied by the story of Mason's discovery and subsequent rescue. Wildlife experts debated the implications, with opinions ranging from calls to study the phenomenon more deeply to insistence that the animals be separated and properly rehabilitated according to standard protocols. Through it all, Mason remained a steadfast presence, his own life transformed in ways he was still coming to understand. Emma had extended her stay in Riverdale, the two of them gradually rebuilding their relationship through shared concern for Thor and conversations that carefully navigated the painful territory of their estrangement. "I missed you, Dad," she admitted one evening as they sat in the small apartment Mason had rented near the veterinary facility. "Even when I was angry about the hunting, even when I couldn't bear to watch you guiding those trophy hunters, I still missed you." Mason nodded, emotion making speech difficult. "I missed you too, kiddo, more than I knew how to say." "Mom would be proud of you," Emma continued softly, "of what you're doing for Thor." "She'd be prouder of you," Mason replied. "The work you're doing with those photographs, it's making people see differently. That's a rare gift." Emma's photographs had indeed captured public imagination, showing Thor's gentle interactions with the smaller animals in ways that challenged conventional understanding of wildlife behavior. The images had sparked a broader conversation about animal cognition, about the capacity for choice even in creatures driven primarily by instinct, about the possibility that humans had underestimated the emotional complexity of the species with whom they shared the planet. 2 weeks after Thor's surgery, Dr. Reynolds called Mason and Emma to her office, her expression suggesting news of significance. To Mason's surprise, Victor was also present, along with Sarah and a representative from the State Wildlife Commission. "We've reached a decision regarding Thor and the other animals," Dr. Reynolds began without preamble. "Based on their unique circumstances and the unprecedented nature of their social bonding, the Commission has approved a specialized rehabilitation plan." The wildlife representative, a serious man in his 50s, took over the explanation. "Normally, we would never consider releasing a grizzly with Thor's behavioral modifications back into the wild. The risks would be too great, both to the bear and to public safety. However, we're facing a unique situation that requires a unique solution." "What kind of solution?" Mason asked, tension evident in his voice. Sarah stepped forward, a cautious smile playing at her lips. "A sanctuary. Not a zoo, not a return to the wild, but something in between. A protected space where Thor and his family can live together safely while allowing for scientific observation of their interactions." "We've been discussing locations," Victor added, surprising Mason with his apparent involvement. "And I've offered a portion of my hunting lease, the northeastern section bordering national forest land." Mason stared at his former friend in disbelief. "Your prime hunting grounds? You're giving them up?" Victor shrugged, a gesture that attempted nonchalance but couldn't quite hide the significance of his decision. "Figure I owe that bear something. Besides, I'm getting too old for the backcountry hunts. Been thinking about scaling back, focusing on the guided photography tours Emma's been talking about." The mention of Emma's involvement was another surprise. Mason glanced at his daughter, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I may have suggested to Victor that there's more money in wildlife photography tours than hunting these days," she admitted, "especially with a unique attraction like Thor's sanctuary to highlight." Mason absorbed this information slowly, recognizing the elegant solution it represented: protection for Thor and his unusual family, a new direction for Victor's business, and perhaps, most importantly, a bridge between the hunting and conservation communities that had been at odds for so long. "There's one more thing," Dr. Reynolds added, her expression suggesting she had saved the most significant news for last. "The sanctuary will need a full-time caretaker, someone who understands both the animals and the land, someone Thor trusts." All eyes turned to Mason. He felt a momentary vertigo, as if standing on the edge of a precipice far more significant than any physical cliff he had navigated in his decades of hunting. "Me?" he asked, voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I'm 70 years old. I don't know the first thing about running a sanctuary." "You know Thor," Sarah pointed out simply. "You know these mountains. You've spent a lifetime understanding the relationship between predator and prey. Who better?" Mason looked from face to face, reading the genuine belief in their expressions. Finally, his gaze settled on Emma. "What do you think, kiddo?" She smiled, Janet's smile on their daughter's face. "I think Mom would say, you found something worth protecting." In that moment, with those words echoing in his mind, Mason Walker, hunter, widower, father, felt the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't known he was solving click into place. The path ahead was uncertain, A journey into territory as uncharted as Thor's remarkable behavior, but it was a path with purpose, with meaning beyond mere survival. "When do we start?" he asked simply. And in a recovery room down the hall, a grizzly bear named Thor rested, healing, waiting, his amber eyes occasionally opening to search for the familiar human presence that had become, against all natural odds, something akin to family. 6 months later, the sanctuary stood complete, a 100-acre haven nestled against the eastern ridge of the mountains, encircled by a specially designed fence that kept Thor and his family safely contained while allowing them the freedom to roam natural terrain. The old Forest Service cabin where Mason and the animals had weathered the storm had been renovated and expanded, becoming both visitor center and Mason's new home. Spring had arrived in full force, transforming the winter bare landscape into a tapestry of green hues and wildflowers. Mason sat on the cabin's newly built porch, morning coffee warming his hands as he watched Thor and his unusual family explore a meadow in the distance. The bear moved with the fluid grace of restored health, his massive form dwarfing the smaller animals that accompanied him everywhere. Luna, now nearly adult-sized but still deferential to Thor. Shadow, the lynx, more independent but always returning to the group. And Rusty, the fox, whose playful antics often seemed to amuse even the dignified grizzly. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Emma's voice came from behind him as she stepped through the cabin door, her own coffee in hand. She had been staying at the sanctuary for the past week, documenting Thor's progress for a feature in National Geographic. "Never gets old," Mason agreed, making room for her on the bench beside him. At 70, he found himself moving more deliberately these days, the aches of age impossible to ignore. Yet he also felt more alive than he had in the 5 years since Janet's death, each day bringing new purpose, new observations, new connections. Emma raised her camera, capturing the distant tableau of animals with the practiced ease of someone who had been photographing wildlife since childhood. "The researchers are coming today, right?" Mason nodded, suppressing a sigh. "4th university team this month. Everyone wants to study the phenomenon, as they keep calling it." "You don't approve?" Emma asked, lowering her camera. "It's not that." Mason struggled to articulate his discomfort. "They're all so determined to explain it, to categorize it, to fit what Thor's doing into their existing frameworks. But sometimes I think they're missing the point." "Which is?" Mason gestured toward the meadow where Thor had just gently nudged Luna away from something he apparently deemed unsafe, his movements careful despite his enormous strength. "That maybe we don't need to explain everything. Maybe we just need to witness it, respect it. Learn from it." Emma studied her father's weathered profile, seeing in it a softening that had been absent during her mother's illness and the difficult years following her death. "You've changed, Dad." "Had to happen eventually," he replied with a small smile. "Your mother always said I was the most stubborn man in Montana. Guess even that has its limits." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as Thor led his family toward the stream that bisected the sanctuary. In the months since their release into this protected space, patterns had emerged that fascinated the scientists and delighted the visitors who came to observe from designated platforms. Thor maintained a consistent patrol of their territory, teaching the younger animals hunting and foraging techniques while continuing to shield them from potential threats. Most remarkably, he seemed to recognize and respond differently to various humans, particularly Mason, whom he would acknowledge with a distinctive rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but rather something like recognition. "The 9 o'clock tour is arriving," Emma noted, gesturing toward the main gate where Sarah's truck was pulling in, followed by a small bus. "Want me to handle this one? You could use a break." Mason shook his head, setting down his coffee cup. "I like doing the tours. Helps people understand." The visitors, A mix of tourists, wildlife enthusiasts, and a few local families gathered eagerly at the observation platform as Mason began his now familiar introduction to the sanctuary and its unusual inhabitants. Emma hung back, photographing not just the animals, but the expressions on people's faces as they observed Thor's gentle interactions with his adopted family. "Isn't it dangerous to have predators together like that?" a woman asked, pointing to where Shadow the lynx and Luna the wolf were sharing space without aggression. "Won't they eventually turn on each other?" "That's what conventional wisdom would suggest," Mason acknowledged. "But Thor seems to have established different rules. He mediates between them, teaches them. We've seen him physically separate them when play gets too rough." "But it's not natural," insisted a man wearing an expensive camera around his neck. "In the wild, these species would be competitors, even enemies." Mason considered this, looking out at Thor, who had settled in a patch of sunlight, the smaller animals arranged around him like satellites around a planet. "Maybe natural is more complex than we thought. Maybe there's room for choice, even in the wild." As the tour continued, Emma noticed Victor's truck approaching along the service road that led to the maintenance area of the sanctuary. In the months since Thor's rescue, the old hunting outfitter had undergone his own transformation, partnering with Mason to establish the sanctuary on land that had once been devoted to trophy hunting. Their rekindled friendship remained cautious, built on mutual respect rather than the easy camaraderie of their younger days, but it was genuine nonetheless. Victor joined them as the tour concluded, nodding a greeting to Emma before approaching Mason. "Got those trail cameras installed on the North Ridge," he reported. "Should give us better coverage of the whole territory now." Mason thanked him, then introduced him to the lingering visitors as the man who made this sanctuary possible, a description that still visibly discomforted Victor, who preferred to downplay his role in Thor's preservation. After the visitors departed for the education center, where Sarah was giving a presentation on bear behavior, the three of them walked toward the meadow where Thor and his family were now resting in the late morning sun. "How's he doing with the new enrichment structures?" Victor asked, referring to the climbing platforms and problem-solving features that had been installed to stimulate the animals mentally. "Thor figured them out in about 5 minutes," Mason replied with undisguised pride, then showed the others how to use them. "That bear's smarter than most people I know." Victor nodded thoughtfully. "Makes you wonder what else they're capable of understanding." They paused at the safety boundary, a subtle marker that delineated the closest point humans were permitted to approach without specialized authorization. Thor, sensing their presence, raised his massive head, nostrils flaring as he processed their scents. After a moment of consideration, he rose and began ambling toward them, the smaller animals following in a now familiar procession. "Still amazes me every time," Victor murmured as the animals approached. 3 years I spent hating that bear, and all along he was doing something remarkable." "Hate's funny that way," Mason observed. "Blinds you to what's right in front of you." Thor stopped at the boundary, settling onto his haunches with a dignity that belied his wild nature. Luna positioned herself at his right shoulder, while Shadow and Rusty arranged themselves nearby, all watching the humans with varying degrees of interest and wariness. Emma raised her camera slowly, capturing the moment, not just the animals, but the expressions on the faces of the 2 old men who had found unexpected purpose in the protection of creatures they once would have hunted. The click of the shutter seemed to interest Thor, his amber eyes tracking the camera's movement. "I keep thinking about what made him this way," Victor said after a moment of silence. "Was it just being raised around other species at that sanctuary? Or is there something more to it?" Mason had pondered this question countless times over the past months, watching Thor's deliberate care of his adopted family, his apparent decision-making that transcended mere instinct. "I think," he said slowly, that all creatures have more capacity for choice than we give them credit for. Most of the time, circumstances don't allow them to exercise it. But Thor got a chance to choose differently. Like you, Emma observed quietly. Like all of us. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah's truck, dust billowing behind it as she drove up the service road with unusual speed. Her expression as she approached was tense, clipboard clutched in her hand. "We've got a situation," she announced without preamble. "The university research team is here, but they've brought someone unexpected, Dr. Lawrence Merritt." Mason frowned, the name vaguely familiar. "The behavioral specialist from Idaho?" Sarah nodded grimly, "and former consultant to the exotic animal sanctuary where Thor was kept. He says he can prove Thor is actually the bear he worked with years ago, a bear that was deliberately conditioned to protect other species as part of a commercial attraction." The implications settled over them like a shadow. If Thor's extraordinary behavior was the result of human conditioning rather than his own choices, it would undermine much of what made the sanctuary special in the public's perception. More practically, it could affect their funding, their research permissions, perhaps even Thor's protected status. "What does he want?" Victor asked, his voice hardening into the tone that had once made him a formidable presence in the hunting community. "To study Thor, to publish his findings, and—" Sarah hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver the final part, "to claim partial ownership rights based on his previous work with the bear." "That's absurd," Emma protested. "Thor's been wild for years. This sanctuary is a protected wildlife rehabilitation facility, not a zoo." "Legally, it's complicated," Sarah admitted. "If Merritt can prove Thor was part of a specific behavioral experiment, he might have grounds to challenge our custody arrangement." Mason had gone very still, his eyes fixed on Thor, who had risen again and was watching them with what seemed like uncanny awareness of the tension in their conversation. "Where is Merritt now?" "At the education center with his team. They're setting up equipment, preparing for observations." Without another word, Mason began walking toward the center, his pace purposeful, despite the slight limp that still marked his gait after all these years. The others exchanged glances before following, recognizing the determination in his bearing. Dr. Lawrence Merritt proved to be a slight, precise man in his 60s, with rimless glasses and the air of academic authority that came from decades in his field. He was directing a team of graduate students in the arrangement of various testing apparatus when Mason entered the education center. "Mr. Walker," Merritt greeted him, extending a hand that Mason did not immediately take. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your discovery of Thor has created quite a stir in behavioral research circles." "Thor wasn't discovered," Mason corrected, his voice level but firm. "He was rescued, and he's not a research subject. He's a wild animal being rehabilitated in a protected sanctuary." Merritt's smile remained in place, though it cooled several degrees. "I understand your attachment to the bear, Mr. Walker. But I believe I can demonstrate that Thor, or Subject 17 as we called him, was part of a groundbreaking behavioral modification program I developed at the Idaho facility. His protection of smaller predators isn't a miracle of nature. It's the result of careful conditioning using operant techniques." "Even if that were true," Mason countered, "it doesn't give you any right to him now. That sanctuary was shut down for animal cruelty. Any claim you might have had was forfeit." "The legal system may disagree," Merritt replied smoothly, "but I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to continue important research that was interrupted by overzealous regulators. Thor represents years of work and significant investment." The conversation might have deteriorated further had Sarah not intervened, suggesting they all sit down to discuss the situation rationally. For the next hour, Merritt outlined his claims, producing photographs, documentation, and research notes that did indeed suggest Thor had been subject to extensive behavioral experiments at the Idaho facility. "We were pioneering interspecies socialization techniques," Merritt explained, spreading photographs across the table showing a younger Thor in various enclosures with other animals. Conditioning large predators to tolerate and eventually protect species they would normally prey upon. The commercial applications were promising. Imagine wildlife parks where visitors could observe predator and prey interacting peacefully. "You were creating a freak show," Victor interjected bluntly, "forcing animals to behave against their nature for profit." Merritt's expression hardened. "We were expanding understanding of behavioral plasticity in apex predators. The entertainment aspect was merely to fund the research." "And when the sanctuary was raided?" Emma asked. "When Thor escaped?" "A catastrophic setback," Merritt acknowledged. "Years of work lost, until now." He leaned forward, his academic detachment slipping to reveal genuine intensity. "Don't you see? Thor is living proof that our methods worked. His continued protection of those smaller animals, years after his conditioning, demonstrates the permanence of the behavioral modifications we achieved. It's revolutionary." Mason had remained silent through much of this exchange, his weathered face unreadable. Now he rose slowly, walking to the window that overlooked the sanctuary grounds where Thor was visible in the distance, still accompanied by his unusual family. "You think you created him?" Mason said finally, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of conviction. "That he's just the product of your conditioning?" "The evidence speaks for itself," Merritt replied. "Those behaviors aren't natural for a grizzly. They're the result of our program." Mason turned back to face the room, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe you did condition him back then. Maybe you taught him to tolerate other species in captivity, but that doesn't explain everything we've seen." "Such as?" Merritt challenged. "Such as his selective interference with hunting parties, specifically targeting Victor's clients while ignoring other hunters. Such as his decision to shelter those specific animals during a storm when he could have abandoned them. Such as his recognition of individual humans, his problem-solving abilities, his apparent teaching behaviors." Mason's voice gained strength as he continued. "Your conditioning might have opened a door, Dr. Merritt, but Thor walked through it on his own. He's been making choices, real choices, that go beyond anything you could have programmed into him." Merritt's dismissive smile suggested he found Mason's interpretation quaint, but unscientific. "Anthropomorphism is a common error among those without training in animal behavior. What you're attributing to choices are simply complex conditioned responses." "Then explain this," Emma intervened, pulling up a series of photographs on her laptop. "These show Thor retrieving wounded animals from hunting sites, treating their injuries with specific plants with medicinal properties, teaching the younger animals to identify safe versus dangerous flora. None of that could have been part of your conditioning program." Dr. Merritt studied the images with reluctant interest, his certainty visibly wavering. "This would require significant extrapolation from basic conditioning. Or it would require that Thor is more than just the sum of your experiments," Mason concluded. "That he's capable of learning, adapting, and yes, choosing beyond whatever you might have taught him." The debate might have continued indefinitely had it not been for a commotion outside, voices raised in alarm, the sound of running feet. Sarah's radio crackled to life with an urgent message from one of the sanctuary staff. "Perimeter breach in Section C. Unauthorized visitors have entered the restricted area." They rushed outside to find sanctuary staff pointing toward the far meadow where 3 figures with cameras were approaching Thor and his family, well beyond the safety boundary. The animals had already noticed the intrusion, with Thor positioning himself between the smaller creatures and the approaching humans. "Journalists," Sarah explained tersely, checking the security feed on her tablet. They climbed the fence to get exclusive close-ups of Thor. Mason's expression darkened. They're going to get themselves killed. Thor's protective instincts— Exactly, Merritt interrupted, an unsettling eagerness in his voice. This is a perfect opportunity to observe the conditioning in action. If my work held, he should interpret them as a threat to the smaller animals and respond defensively. These are people's lives you're talking about, Mason snapped, already moving toward the utility vehicle they used for rapid transit around the sanctuary. Thor may be conditioned or he may be choosing, but either way, he's still a wild grizzly with the strength to kill a human instantly. He drove toward the meadow at dangerous speed, Sarah beside him radioing instructions to the other staff. Behind them, Emma, Victor, and Merritt followed in a second vehicle. The intruders had advanced to within 30 yards of Thor, far too close for safety, especially with the smaller animals present, which would trigger the bear's protective instincts. Thor had risen to his full height, an intimidating sight that finally seemed to register with the trespassers, who had stopped their approach but continued photographing. The bear issued a warning rumble, herding Luna, Shadow, and Rusty behind his massive form. Mason braked the vehicle at the edge of the meadow and stepped out, calling to the intruders, "Back away slowly. Do not run. Move toward me, not away from the bear." The journalists, 2 men and a woman, none equipped for proper wildlife interaction, finally seemed to grasp their danger. They began backing away as instructed, but one man stumbled, dropping his expensive camera with a clatter that echoed across the open space. Thor's reaction was immediate, a thundering roar and 2 aggressive steps forward, posture shifting from warning to imminent charge. The journalists froze in terror, exactly the wrong response. Without hesitation, Mason moved forward, placing himself between Thor and the trespassers, hands raised in a gesture that had become familiar between them over months of interaction. "Easy, Thor," he called, voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Easy, old boy. They're not a threat." For a tense moment that stretched like eternity, Thor remained poised to charge, his amber eyes locked on Mason's. Something passed between them in that gaze, communication beyond words, beyond species. Then, with deliberate control, Thor lowered himself, rumbling a final warning but stepping back toward the smaller animals. "Move now," Mason instructed the journalist without turning. "Slowly, back to the vehicle." They complied, ashen-faced and silent. Once they were safely retreating, Mason remained, maintaining eye contact with Thor until the bear finally huffed what sounded remarkably like exasperation and turned away, shepherding his family toward the stream and away from the disturbance. Only then did Mason rejoin the others, adrenaline ebbing to leave him feeling every one of his 70 years. The journalists were already being escorted from the sanctuary by security staff, their apologies falling on deaf ears. "That was remarkable," Merritt said, scientific detachment momentarily abandoned in genuine awe. "He recognized you, responded to you, overrode his defensive conditioning based on your intervention." Mason leaned against the vehicle, suddenly weary. "Like I said, he's choosing." The incident transformed the tenor of their discussions with Merritt. Faced with direct evidence of Thor's behavior that transcended simple conditioning, the researcher's certainty had been shaken. Over the following days, as he observed Thor's interactions with his family and with sanctuary staff, Merritt's position gradually shifted from ownership claims to requests for research collaboration. "I still believe the foundation for his behavior began with our conditioning program," Merritt admitted during their final meeting. "But I concede that what Thor has developed since then goes beyond anything we anticipated or could have programmed. He's exceptional." "So you're dropping your legal claims?" Sarah pressed, ever practical. Merritt nodded reluctantly. "In exchange for research access and co-authorship on future publications about Thor's behavior." There's more to learn here than to gain through legal battles. With that potential crisis averted, life at the sanctuary settled back into its rhythm. Summer arrived in full force, bringing increased visitor numbers and new challenges as Thor's family continued to grow and develop. Luna had matured into a magnificent wolf, occasionally venturing to the boundaries of their territory but always returning to Thor. Shadow had become an efficient hunter, sometimes bringing smaller prey back to share with the group in a reversal of natural order that fascinated observers. Rusty remained the most playful, his antics sometimes drawing what observers swore was the ursine equivalent of an indulgent smile from Thor. For Mason, each day brought new observations, new connections, and new understanding of both the animals in his care and his own place in the world Janet had left behind. The sanctuary had become more than a project or a job. It was a calling, a purpose that filled the void her absence had left. Emma visited regularly, her photography documenting Thor's unusual family while helping to heal her relationship with her father. On a particularly golden evening in late summer, Mason sat on his porch as twilight painted the mountains in hues of amber and purple. Thor and his family were visible at the edge of the meadow, silhouetted against the setting sun as they made their way toward the den they had established near the stream. The bear moved with the unhurried confidence of a creature in its rightful place, secure in its role and purpose. "Quite a view," came Victor's voice as the older man joined Mason on the porch, lowering himself with the careful movements of someone well acquainted with joint pain. "Best office in Montana," Mason agreed, pouring a second cup of coffee from the thermos beside him. They sat in companionable silence, watching the animals disappear into the gathering shadows. 5 years earlier, both men had been locked in bitter opposition, their lifelong friendship fractured by grief and differing values. Now, like Thor and his unlikely family, they had found a way to transcend expected boundaries. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Victor said finally. "What if we're all wrong about what's natural? What if creatures, humans included, are capable of more choices than we've been willing to see?" Mason considered this, the philosophy unexpectedly profound coming from a man who had spent decades as a hunting outfitter. Janet used to say something similar, that love wasn't instinct or chemistry but choice, the daily decision to care for something beyond yourself. Smart woman, you're Janet. Smarter than me, that's for sure. Mason's gaze returned to where Thor had disappeared into the trees. Took me 70 years and a bear with unconventional ideas to start figuring out what she understood all along. As darkness settled fully over the sanctuary, Mason reflected on the journey that had brought him here, from the grief-stricken hunter ready to end his life to the caretaker of a place dedicated to preservation and understanding. Thor had saved him as surely as he had saved Thor, each of them choosing a path different from what nature or circumstance had seemed to dictate. In the distance, Thor's distinctive rumble echoed across the sanctuary, a sound Mason had come to recognize not as a warning, but as communication, the bear's equivalent of calling his family home for the night. It was a sound that represented everything the sanctuary stood for, the possibility of connection across differences, of choices that transcended boundaries, of seeing beyond the surface to the deeper possibilities within all living things. Mason raised his coffee cup in a silent toast to the darkened forest where Thor and his family now rested. "To choices," he murmured, Janet's presence beside him as real in that moment as the mountain air. "And to second chances." The sanctuary continued to grow in both scope and reputation over the following months. Research teams came and went, each contributing to the expanding understanding of Thor's remarkable behavior and its implications for wildlife science. Visitors arrived from across the country and beyond, drawn by Emma's photographs and the story of the bear who had chosen to protect rather than prey upon smaller animals. Through it all, Mason remained the sanctuary's heart and soul, its most dedicated observer, its most passionate advocate, and the human with whom Thor maintained the strongest connection. At 70, he had found not just purpose, but joy. His life intertwined with the unusual family he had helped save on that fateful day in the forest. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments of dawn or dusk, he spoke aloud to Janet as if she could hear him, sharing observations about Thor's latest behaviors or Emma's recent visit, well, that was between him and the mountains that had shaped his life. Some bonds, like those between Thor and his adopted family, transcended conventional understanding. Some choices, once made, reshaped not just the future, but the meaning of the past. In the end, that was the true legacy of the sanctuary, not just the protection of an unusual bear and his improbable family, but the demonstration that in a world often defined by boundaries and limitations, there remained the possibility of choosing differently, of seeing beyond the expected to the extraordinary potential that existed in all living things. And that, Mason reflected as he watched Thor lead his family across the morning-lit meadow, was something worth protecting indeed. Dear friends, have you ever wondered if it's too late to find new purpose? Mason Walker's journey reminds us that at 70, life can reveal its most profound gifts when we least expect them. Like Mason, many of us have weathered loss, faced emptiness, and questioned our worth in the years after careers wind down or loved ones leave us. Yet his story shows that our golden years can be precisely that, golden with meaning, connection, and joy we never imagined possible. When Mason found Thor, he wasn't seeking redemption, he was ending his journey. Instead, he discovered that our capacity to care, to protect what matters, and to form unexpected bonds doesn't diminish with age, it deepens. This bear and his unlikely family remind us that nature's most beautiful lesson might be that it's never too late to choose differently, to find common ground with those we once opposed, to rebuild relationships we thought were lost forever. Have you experienced an unexpected second chapter in your life? What unlikely connection or purpose has given you renewed meaning when you thought your story was ending? Share your story below. Because, like Mason and Thor, we're stronger when we recognize we're not alone on this journey.